Hey, welcome along to another selection of questions from Mark Steyn Club members around the planet that we didn't quite get to when we did our live audio edition a couple of days ago. And in fact, on that show, I mentioned a long story that some years ago at the United States Senate, Strom Thurmond, back when he was a whippersnapper of just 112, something like that, had mistaken me for the petite brunette senator from California, crazy liberal Democrat, Barbara Boxer. And Josh Passell writes, "You get mistaken for Barbara Boxer. If I had a nickel for every time someone asked me if I was Mamie Eisenhower, I'd be a wealthy man." Well, Josh, I do get mistaken for Barbara Boxer, as I said, back in the United States Senate. So ever since then, it's happened all the time. It's very easy to confuse us. Here's a picture of Barbara Boxer. That's me, and this is Barbara Boxer. So it's very easy to get us confused. By the way, if you're wondering how close a resemblance there is between Josh Passell and Mamie Eisenhower, here's a picture of Josh. Yeah. Anyway, on to the proper questions. We had a sort of Five Eyes theme on Mark's mailbox, in that we were talking about the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, who are all in the Five Eyes intelligence sharing program. So I thought I'd share the intelligence of our various listeners and viewers in all those 5 countries. Lawrence Brennan writes, "Any comment on the Muslims in Birmingham, or Brum, objecting to sex education in school that also discusses gay sex? Is intersectionality showing cracks, or are the Muslims now so sure of themselves they can be openly homophobic? Will the quote-unquote Christian ministers stand up?" Because, you know, there's a fascinating discussion going on among Islamic scholars at the moment, has been for some time, whether the correct attitude to homosexuals is to throw them off the roof of a tall building or to burn them alive. It's a fascinating theological discussion. Oddly enough, a surprising number of imams say they're cool with either. They're not really worried. Pick whichever one you like. They're fine with it. But the point about identity politics is there's always a hierarchy. We see this in some of the transgender takeover of girls' sports, that basically trans trumps feminism these days. Trans also, you get in Britain, for example, there's quite a group of lesbians. I think they were putting flyers up around Liverpool. They're very opposed to the whole transgender thing, and they dislike the way that they're being told you've got to accept the idea of women with penises, because lesbians think that's just a way to reimpose the patriarchy by the back door, if I got that right. Anyway, the point here is there's a hierarchy in identity politics. And when it comes to hierarchies, generally, however you slice it, Islam is at the top. And we've been here before. If you remember a few years ago, I think this is in my book Lights Out, there was a big kerfuffle at the schools in Bristol over the same thing, sex education involving aspects of the gay life that Muslims objected to. This is for books like Heather Has Two Mommies. And if you're in, say, the British Columbia school system and you protest against your kid being taught Heather has two mommies, they say, well, you uptight Squaresville Christian evangelicals just need to get with the program. But when the Muslims object, suddenly, whoops, Heather has two mommies vanishes from the shelves. That's what happened in Bristol. So if it's a contest between Heather has two mommies and Heather has two imams, bet on Heather has two imams every time. Or in fact, Heather has 4 mommies and a big bearded daddy who wants to marry her off to her first cousin back in Pakistan. There's a hierarchy of identity politics, and it's foolish not to recognize the way that hierarchy is already asserting itself. Owen Morgan, I dealt with Owen's question on our audio edition, which was about David David Cameron, Theresa May, and the whole Brexit imbroglio. And Owen thanks me and says, I have to say that I share your contempt for David Cameron. He promised to renegotiate Britain's membership of the European Union, but achieved nothing of the sort and never really intended to. He entered into a referendum which he expected to win, mainly because the dice were so loaded against leave. When he lost, we got Il Gran Rifiuto, Mark II. That's a little Dante for you there, the great rejection. Cameron wouldn't contemplate implementing Brexit because the possibility of a pro-Brexit result in the referendum had never crossed his mind. He had never given a moment's thought to the idea of leaving the EU. Cameron was intellectually and temperamentally incapable of delivering Brexit, so he scrambled overboard and left Britain in the hands of Theresa May. I think all this, actually, Owen, goes back to David Cameron. And actually, it's difficult. You say, I have to say that I share your contempt for David Cameron. I think it's very difficult not to have total contempt for David Cameron. Circa, what would this be, 2014? He was concerned that the Tories were hemorrhaging too many supporters to Nigel Farage and UKIP. So in the 2015 election, he would not have won had he not promised a referendum on the EU. And it was, as you say, it was a completely cynical move because it never occurred to him in his wildest dreams that he would lose that referendum. He lacked the imaginative capacity to conceive of David Cameron losing. And he had, like so many other politicians, an indestructible sense of his own indispensability. And so he took it personally. If you recall, I remember this, I happened to be in London and on the night of the referendum, and at 10 p.m. I switched on the BBC. That was my first mistake. And Nigel Farage came on and said, I think we may well have fallen a little short. So I thought, I can't face, 6 hours of David Dimbleby gloating. So I switched it off, went to bed, and in the morning I had to get up because I was taking the little shuttle over to Dublin. And I switched on, got up early in the morning, switched on, just as the ashen-faced BBC panel were announcing that the British people had voted to overturn the entire thrust of post-Second World War British foreign policy. And I was elated. And my car came to take me to Heathrow, and the driver had the radio on, and just before we got to the airport, David Cameron, having had about 2 hours sleep, if that, came out and announced he was having a big old hissy fit and resigned. And that fact, that action, that immaturity, that stupid spoilt brat move, it was his referendum. He called it. He put it in his election platform. He owns it. For God's sake, man, what is wrong with you? It was part of your election platform. You owed it. You owed it to the British people, having given that referendum, to deliver on the results of the referendum. And because he's too contemptible and dishonourable a twerp to do that, he set in motion a staggering 3 years of chaos. Because that was 2016. It seems like ancient history now. Britain voted to leave. 2017, because she'd just taken over as Prime Minister and she hadn't gone to the polls and she didn't feel she... if you have never run an election as the party leader, there's always a certain amount of, legitimacy questions, mandate questions. So because David Cameron had flounced off in a big Queenie huff and she'd won, she felt she needed to hold an early election in which, because Jeremy Corbyn was pretending he was going to deliver Brexit, he managed to take just enough of Theresa May's seats to deprive the Tories of a majority, and the whole thing started wobbling and falling to pieces. It's a contemptible cynicism by the Cameron-era political class in Britain that has got us to this point. David Cameron, by the way, is why people hate politicians. Because they're all born, they all seem to come off some factory production line somewhere in wherever it is. And I think Cameron's big job before he actually became a member of Parliament, he was, if memory serves, he was the guy who was responsible for writing Conservative ministers' topical pop cultural references when they went on the BBC Question Time show in the late 90s. So he would write, so you'd have these old square guys, and he would write them topical pop cultural references. So they'd say things like, I have one message to Tony Blair, you are the weakest link, goodbye. Or, I think Tony Blair should be voted off the island. That's what David Cameron did for a living. They're all the same, these people. They come off the factory production line and they live inside the Westminster Village or the Beltway or whatever you want to call it. And they, none of them bear any real relation to where the people they govern live. Anyway, I'm getting a bit carried away with that. Let's go on to, this is an American question from Nicola Timmerman. And Nicola says, what I never got about the Russian collusion story was the fact that the Russians spent a few $100,000 on Facebook and had a couple of rallies supporting, one of which supported Hillary. How was this supposed to influence the election compared to Jeb Bush's millions, which had no effect? Yeah, until Vladimir Putin came along, none of us knew that, in fact, you could basically buy the election for just $100,000 worth of Facebook ads put together by a few Macedonian content farmers. Instead, the way you win elections in America is you're supposed to raise $100 million and then give it to slick consultants like Mike Murphy, who Jeb Bush hired, and who wrote to me pointing out that even if Trump won New Hampshire, it wouldn't make any difference because Jeb had already bought all the available TV spots in South Carolina, so Trump wouldn't be able to capitalize on his victory. Trump did us all a great disservice by proving how useless all these consultants are. And Jeb Bush spent $100 million, to get 2.4% in Iowa. I could get 2.4% in Iowa, and I'm not even eligible to run. But according to the Democrats' theory, the Russians spending $100,000 on Facebook ads changed the result of the election. So if you're one of the Democrats who's thinking of running, I don't care whether you're Beto O'Rourke or you're Cory Booker or you're Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren, forget the big fancy consultants. Just call up Putin in the Kremlin and say, hey, I understand it was $100,000 last time. I'm ready to give you, like, let's say 125. Go knock yourself out, Vlad. That's how easy it is. We didn't really get to Australia in our Five Eyes special, except I couldn't remember the name of the Prime Minister who'd put his hand on the Queen's bottom. And a lot of Aussies wrote to me that, in fact, it was Paul Keating. And if you recall, all the tabloid newspapers showed him with his hand about the Queen's person, and under the headline, The Lizard of Oz. And the Lizard of Oz was, in fact, Paul Keating. And as I said, when I saw the picture of Justin Trudeau with his hand on her vice-regal excellency, the Governor-General of Canada's bottom, it always reminds me of those German ads they put out for the excitable young Mohammedan lads, the refugees from Syria and so forth, when they've been getting a little too frisky in the communal swimming pool. And they have these signs there, the girl in the bikini and the bikini bottom, and a hand hovering over her right buttock with a big red X through it. And I always think when you're around the Australian and Canadian Prime Ministers, and if you're the Queen or one of her viceroys, you could do with that, like the royal bottom with a big red and a prime ministerial hand hovering over it and a big red X over it. Anyway, also from Australia, David P. writes, hi Mark, do you regret your prior positive comments about Julie Bishop? Have you seen what a trail of destruction she has left around her? Julie Bishop was the Foreign Minister of Australia. Kate Smythe adds, don't forget Alexander Downer. There's something about Mark and Australian foreign ministers. Alexander Downer, you may recall, after he was foreign minister, he became Australian High Commissioner in the United Kingdom. Nobody American knows what a High Commissioner is, and I'm not going to tell you. But he briefly attached himself to the American public consciousness because he was the guy who was having a drink with George Papadopoulos when Papadopoulos started blabbing, supposedly, about what the Russians had on Hillary or whatever it was in some London wine bar. And it was it was an interesting moment that basically Papadopoulos was invited over to the UK, was wining and dining with people way out of his pay league, and among them was Alexander Downer. Julie Bishop, I want to say this. Julie Bishop, it's not necessary to agree with me 100%. I mean, if I was just to hang out with people who agree with me 100%, I would have a very lonely life. Same thing if I just hung out with people who agree with me on 90% or 80% or 63%. And Julie Bishop is from the Liberal wing of the Australian Liberal Party. She's socially liberal. I'm not particularly. I'm quite stern and unbending on a lot of that stuff. She's a Republican, not a monarchist. I'm on the wrong side of her on that thing. But she has always been strong on free speech, certainly compared with most of her equivalents in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada. When she went to visit the offices of Charlie Hebdo after the massacre of their cartoonists and editors and writers, and she said, "We just want to say, love your work." I thought that was a very straightforward and honest and Australian reaction in that respect. And the last time I was down in Australia, she was deputy to Malcolm Turnbull, who was the Prime Minister down there. And I was in Australia, touring around Australia, and my American manager was there. And she assumed, because I'd been going on TV every night insulting Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister, that Malcolm's loyal number two would not want to be seen anywhere near me. And so she wouldn't want to come, as she'd done the time I was there a couple of years earlier, and introduced me when I was speaking in Parliament and everything. And instead, actually, Julie said, no, I'm coming along to introduce him, even though I'd been like as rude and unpleasant as possible about her boss as one could be. And my manager said, well, this makes no sense at all. This would never happen in America. Imagine if you'd just been, insulting Barack Obama on every TV show in sight, and then Joe Biden says, oh yeah, sure, I'll introduce Steyn when he comes to speak in Congress or whatever. So one shouldn't, as I said, one shouldn't just seek the companionship of those who agree with you or 100% on everything. Scott Scherzer says, Dear Mark, can you please try to explain the Beto O'Rourke phenomenon to me? He comes across as a complete zero intellectually and doesn't possess an ounce of charisma. I don't get it, says Scott Scherzer in Miami Beach. That's the point. The whole point about politics on the Democrat side is the suspension of disbelief, as we used to say in the theater or motion pictures. They're selling you something that is inherently ridiculous and daring you to call them on them. This is a rich, white, middle-aged son of privilege, and he's running as a Hispanic middle schooler who just, like, he comes skateboarding in. He's like 40 years too old to be on a skateboard. But everyone thinks, oh, this is groovy. Look, this isn't, this is exciting. What's his foreign policy? What's his economic? Who cares? Look at him come skateboarding in. And it's the whole point now about identity politics is self-definition. So Elizabeth Warren is 1024th Cherokee. And that's enough to make her Harvard Law School's first woman of color. And that's how it goes. That's all you need. And if she, being 1024th Cherokee, can be Harvard Law School's first woman of color, why cannot a middle-aged kid of rich white parents be a skateboarding Hispanic middle schooler? It's not at all ridiculous. It's no more ridiculous than all the transgender athletes winning the girls' school athletics competitions in Connecticut. Self-definition. That's the way to go. That's the way to go. And he's doing it. I think he, if things get difficult round about Iowa, New Hampshire, he should not just be a Hispanic skateboarding middle schooler. He should try being a Hispanic transgender skateboarding middle schooler. Whatever it takes. Self-definition is the way to go. Joseph Dornish says, I'll keep asking this until I see it answered. Can you explain just exactly how you are an optimist, as you claim to be? You certainly seem fairly pessimistic on Western civilization, Europe, the USA, etc., in most of what you say and write. Well, I can be pessimistic, but it's never over till it's over. And the point, Joseph, as a lot of what we've been talking about, is it's never a numbers game, is it? I mean, you know, basically the British political class lost on Brexit, but they didn't care about that. They're still going to ram through whatever the hell it is they want to do, this permanent vassal status for the United Kingdom in Europe. They don't care about 51% or 52%. It's never about numbers. It never, on almost anything you care to think of. In 1940, if you'd asked the majority of the British people, they'd much rather have taken Lord Halifax's side and cut a deal with Germany. Churchill's position was the minority position. The revolutionaries' position was the minority position in 1776. History isn't made by people who wait to get 51% of the great mass on their side. So it's never just a numbers game. It's never just a numbers game. And we do not know. Nothing is foreordained, preordained. Nothing is. And so I do remain an optimist. And I'm pleasantly surprised sometimes, as in the Brexit vote. I went to bed very depressed. Well, not depressed, but just fatalistic. And I woke up and had the biggest laugh of my life and was roaring my head off with the cab driver as he took me to Heathrow that morning. Likewise, round about 10 p.m., right about the time the Florida vote came in on election night 2016. Up until that point, the New York Times homepage showed that Hillary had a 97% chance, or whatever it was, of becoming president. Then Trump won Florida, and she took the express elevator to the basement of history. You never know what's going to happen, Joseph, and that's why I am an optimist. And with that, we shall leave it. If you want to take part in these, you can actually... we start with the audio edition, which we usually do Tuesdays at 4 p.m. North American Eastern Time. That's 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time in these summer months, wherever you might happen to be. And then we usually do a video mailbox as a follow-up afterwards. But thank you for all your questions. We'll get to a whole nother batch of them in a couple of days, and we will see you next time.